if you'll pardon this little matter that I need to take care of before I do other things tonight, I would appreciate it. I closed out a meeting Wednesday night in Halligen. Is that, I never know if that's correct, whether you pronounce that or not, Texas. It's way down as far as you can go in Texas without getting into the Gulf of Mexico. And I stayed with L.Q. and Sue Lowe. And they told me that there's somebody here in the Park Hill congregation, I don't know who they are, that they're related to. And they told me to say howdy. So howdy. Whoever you are, consider yourselves properly helloed from the Lowes. I never can come in this auditorium without remembering all kinds of things, like, for example, the building of it, and that dates me just a little bit. But I remember the beams in this place going up, and I remember as a small boy thinking that this had to be absolutely the biggest place on earth, biggest building that had ever been built. And I remember young people, we had about, I don't know, 2 or 3 rows pretty much full that would sit right over there in that area. And I remember that situation well. I remember my mother and dad sitting right there, that second pew, year after year. And my dad was an elder of the congregation here for a good while. I even remember things like the pews going in. I don't know if they've ever been up or moved or anything since the building was built, but a whole bunch of people got together one night, or maybe a couple of nights, I don't know, and these pews were secured where they are by the brethren. And I come in here and my mind is just flooded with all kinds of memories, and just can't help but say a word or two about that. I recognize the fact that this is Friday night, and I'm sure that most of you are in the habit of doing something else besides this. And you like to go out and eat, and you like to do one thing and another, but you've chosen to come and be with us, and I am very appreciative of the fact that you are here. Now let me say to you that I do not come here considering myself some great big expert of some sort on all the problems of the brotherhood and on all the things that divide us, that have divided us now for a good while. If you're looking for somebody like that, you have the wrong fella tonight. But I have studied some in connection with some of these problems, and I have some conclusions that I have drawn with reference to the same, and I'm going to present some of those to you. And if you judge those conclusions to be biblical, if you judge them to be good and helpful, then you take them and run with them. But then on the other hand, if you, for some reason or other, judge them to be otherwise, then you deal with them as you see fit. There is no way in the world that I can talk about the kinds of things that we're going to be discussing without flavoring it all with my own convictions about things. It would be crazy if I didn't do that, if I got up here and tried to talk about all of these matters without getting my convictions into the discussion. I'd tell you the truth, I wouldn't know how to do that in the first place, and otherwise, I say to you again, it'd just be crazy. If a preacher gets up to preach and I'm sitting out there listening to what it is that he has to say, I want to hear what he thinks about a matter. I want to know his studied conclusions. And I want to know what he has on his mind in terms of the convictions that he has formulated about a given matter. And if he's going to try to talk some way or other without expressing those things, I don't know, but I think I'd kind of have a hard time getting real interested in what's going on at that time. So I say to you again that this will necessarily be a part of the various points that I will be making. Time element always enters into preaching. If you preach a big long time, brethren get irritated with you. And that's just kind of the way that is. And so you have to be respectful, or you need to be, I guess, aware of time element. And time element forbids me from trying to get into and make mention of and talk about the details of every single kind of problem that we might have and every thing that might have divided us along through the years. And what I'm going to do, and I kind of have a feeling what the brethren have in mind here for me to do, is to narrow all of this down to things that have to do with institutionalism, the work of the church, church cooperation, all that sort of thing. And so my discussion tonight will be limited to such as that. Now, tomorrow night, we will broaden out a bit, and we'll talk about several matters that we'll not get into this discussion, obviously, but we will confine our remarks, at least for the most part, to that sort of thing this evening. And I don't know all of you that are here. I don't know how well studied you might be with regard to institutional problems, the problems that we've had now for a few decades. I don't know how much studying you've done in connection with church cooperation and sponsoring churches and the collectivity of churches and all that sort of thing. But I will try to state my convictions about these matters in as simple terms as I know how, and at the same time still try to get the job done. The assignment for tonight has to do with two parts. When did all these problems come about? And when did these divisions occur? And then why did they occur? And I don't mind telling you in the outset here that we're going to be lopsided in dealing with those two things. And I'm going to do that, not necessarily of necessity. I'd round up a bunch of names and dates and facts and what have you, and kind of split it down the middle if I were inclined to do that. I mean, I'm not inclined to do that, and so I'm not going to do it. And I'll tell you why I'm not. There is not one thing in the world that we can do about the when part. We can talk about it, and when we get through talking about it, we can say, well, that sure was something. But that's all we can do. I can't change anything that happened in the 40s. I wish I could, but I don't have the ability to do that. I can't change things that happened in the 50s and the 60s and along in there. Don't have the ability to do that kind of thing. We can absolutely do nothing at all about the when of this discussion. And because of that, I'm just not inclined to spend 30 minutes on it. Now, that may be good judgment, may be bad judgment, I don't know, but that's the way I feel about it. And so we are going to be way, way lopsided. I'm going to talk just a little bit about when some of these things came about. But then when I get through with that, I'm going to emphasize what it is that I want to emphasize in the main, and that's the why. I want to know why all this came about, and why it is that the divisions occurred, and why it is that they still exist today. And I want to know what it is that we might be able to do about it. It looks to me like if we define the why, we at the same time get to the business of maybe making some decisions about what it is that we could do about it. And there are some things we can do about it. We don't have to look at this mess and just say, oh, well, that's the way it is, and we just forget about it and go on about our business. We don't have to do that. If everybody was of the mind to solve some of the problems that prevail, we could do so. No question about that. I'm a little bit inclined to think that those of you that are here tonight are of that disposition. If you were not of that disposition, I can't imagine why you might be here to hear this kind of discussion. Well, all right, now having said that, let's talk I'm just going to make a few brief comments about the 40s and the 50s and the 60s, and then we'll get on with the other part of our discussion. Really, if you want to lay a good foundation to talk about the sponsoring church and all that sort of thing, you need to go all the way back to the turn of the century, controversies just before that and around that period of time and all, but I am not going to take the time to do that. Not interested in doing that tonight. But I will tell you this. In the 40s, there was a great push made by some of our brethren to get the colleges in the budget of the churches. Now, I was born in 40, so I was very young while a lot of that was being initiated and going on. Maybe there are some of you here that are a little older than I, and maybe you remember some of the details of that better than I might be inclined to do so, but I do know that it is a fact that during that decade, in the 40s, some of our brethren decided that it is time to start pushing the colleges in connection with trying to get them in the budgets of the churches of Christ. And various ones spearheaded that particular movement. M.B. Hardeman was one that was at the helm. Brother Brewer was involved in pushing that, and quite a few other men that were highly respected. But I'll tell you what they did. They ran into a brick wall of a kind, and that brick wall was named Foy Wallace Jr. And it was also constituted of C.R. Nickel. And it was constituted of R.L. Whiteside and such men as that. And you know what they said? They said they shall not pass. And it isn't going to happen. And those fellows wrote, and they preached, and of course others followed suit. And that little movement right there pretty much came to a screeching halt. I mean, to tell you that they ran into a brick wall. And the preaching and the teaching was essentially, what in the world is this all about? That the churches have no business at all engaging in this kind of activity and making contributions to human institutions and arrangements and providing secular education and et cetera, et cetera. And that was the kind of preaching that was being done, and I say to you again that they ran into a brick wall. And when Brother Foy Wallace Jr. would say to somebody, they shall not pass, he had a tendency to be very, very serious about that. And they did not. And all of a sudden, there was a shift in things. When you start getting to the early 50s and on into the decade of the 50s. Now, I don't mean to say that all efforts to push the colleges, that all of that fell by the wayside, because all efforts did not fall by the wayside. But that matter subsided at least somewhat. And then all of a sudden, there was another push that was on. And this push had an added consideration that the college in the budget, preaching and pushing, didn't have. And that was, it had an emotional aspect to it that was tremendous. And it was the push in connection with the benevolent homes in the budget of the churches. Now, I'm not going to stand up here. I'm not going to tell you that the first orphan homes in connection with the churches of Christ and all that came about in the 50s. That's not so. I think the first orphan home that we know anything about in that regard is a Tennessee orphan home, started back in 1905 or 6 or somewhere along in there. So I'm not saying that when you get to the 50s, all of a sudden you have something that is brand new on the scene, because that is not so. But in terms of a thrust, and in terms of brethren really getting behind something and pushing it with their might, all of a sudden we shifted from the college over to the benevolent homes, and it just so happened that to a tremendous extent that particular matter worked. And you know why it worked? It worked because of the emotional appeals that were there. And they were made, and they were drained, and it worked. And then all of a sudden now great opposition was mustered against that too. But still the push was on, and the push enjoyed a tremendous degree of success among the churches of Christ in the land. And about that same time, by the way, in the 50s, we have coming on the scene, not at all meaning that, again, this is the beginning of this kind of thing either, but coming on the scene during that period of time was the Herald of Truth, as it was called. And the Herald of Truth was the thing that really put the controversy of the sponsoring church arrangement on the map. Now again, don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying that's the beginning of the controversy over sponsoring church arrangements, because that is not so at all. There was a big deal that went on down in Texas, and they wouldn't use the expression missionary society. They used the expression giving and receiving churches. That was terminology that they used to try to get around some problems and some other matters. But it amounted to, down there, a program or programs having to do with sponsoring churches. That's what it amounted to. One congregation being the receiving church, taking in funds from churches wherever, and then taking those funds and doing a job, a work of some kind out here, to which, as we say from time, they were all equally related. But that equally related business seemed to matter very little to anybody at all. And the sponsoring church kind of thing picked up impetus. And again, I say to you that by the 50s, all of a sudden, the Herald of Truth was all over everywhere, television, radio, everybody knew about it, and it became the center of the controversy having to do with the sponsoring church arrangement, and the battle ensued, and rightly so. There was great opposition to the receiving, giving, receiving kind of a thing. There was a great opposition to the sponsoring church arrangement on the basis of the Bible teaches the independence of local congregations, and the business of collective action of churches is the opposite of that. You cannot have the one in the presence of the other. And the opposition was exactly and precisely correct, and I'll tell you how long it will take you to establish that, about 5 minutes with a good English dictionary at home. You cannot have independent action, collective action going on simultaneously. You cannot have that. They're opposite, just like you can't have light and dark in the same space at the same time. You cannot have that kind of thing going on. And to the extent churches were being involved in the sponsoring church arrangements, to that same extent they were selling down the river their independence. Now they denied it. They said it is not so because we voluntarily participate in this kind of arrangement, and therefore we are not selling down the river our independence. But it doesn't make any difference whether you volunteer or you do not volunteer. That has nothing to do with the nature of the action itself. And why that is such a hard thing to see, I don't know. I have never been able to understand why that is difficult to see. It doesn't make any difference whether we are volunteers or whether we are coerced. It is the nature of the action that becomes the thing that is to be tested. And the question becomes, does the New Testament teach independence of local churches or not? If it does, then I'm here to tell you tonight that the sponsoring church arrangement is without biblical precedence. Now, if the Bible doesn't teach local congregation independence, then so be it. So be it. Let the system stand. Let's propagate it. Let's get behind it and use it for all that we're worth. But anyway, the sponsoring church arrangement developed there in the 50s, along with, it picked up its impetus in connection with the Herald of Truth, because it came on the scene about that time, along with the big push in connection with the benevolent societies. Now, when we come to the 60s, and I'm not going to impugn motives. That is not why I am here tonight, and I'm not going to try to do that at all. But it is just passing strange to me that in the 40s the push went on with reference to getting the colleges in the budget of the churches. It didn't work. We backed off. Then the push was on in connection with the emotional business of the orphan homes and the benevolent societies, and because of the emotional aspect that was there, that worked. And then lo and behold, as we get into the 60s, Batsell Barrett, Baxter, and others. But I mentioned Brother Baxter because he's the one that came out with the tract that had in it the famous statement where he said, and he was as right as he could possibly be, and that is that the colleges and the benevolent homes, they stand or fall together. And I say to you again that I'm not going to impugn motives. That is not why I'm here, and I'm not interested in doing that. But as you look at that overall situation there, it is more than passing strange in terms of how it all developed. And again, I say to you that Batsell Barrett Baxter, he knew exactly what he was doing. He knew what he was saying, and what he said in his tract was so. And that is to say that the college in the budget and the benevolent homes in the budget, they stand or they fall together. And it is my judgment, along with a lot of other brethren, that they fall together. For the simple reason that there is no Bible authority. You can't put a finger on it. It has been tried now for decades, and it should be in good evidence that it cannot be done. There is not a brother anywhere that can put a finger on a passage of Scripture that authorizes churches of Christ to set up human institutions out here to do anything. I don't care what it is. And that includes colleges, and that includes hospitals, and that includes benevolent homes, homes for unwed mothers, widowages, whatever. There is not one single iota, passage of Scripture anywhere that even begins to start to commence to authorize such a thing as that. It has been argued, the debates have been held, the articles have been written, the preaching has been done. For the most part, the dust has pretty well settled, and most folks are either here or yonder. But I am here to tell you tonight that the passages are not there. And if you are interested in trying, then you get after it. If you've never engaged in that exercise, I would encourage you tonight with all of my might to get involved in that exercise. See if you can find the reference to anything in the text that authorizes churches of Christ to set up as adjuncts to the church human institutions through which and by which to do the work that the Lord has assigned the church to do. And get after it. You work on it with all of your might. And if you find them, you let me know. And I promise you, if you find them, I will be happy to accept them, and I'll be happy to preach them next Sunday. Or the next Sunday, down at Greenwood, wherever. I'll be very happy to do that, if you can find such. Well, that's all I'm going to say about the when. Matter of fact, it took more time to do that than I intend to. Now I want to talk about the why. I want to know why all this has come about. And again, I say to you that there's kind of an implicit side to this. I can see I'm not going to have time tonight to talk about solutions and all, but the implicit in the whys of all of this are the solutions. And I would hope that everybody here tonight would see that and will keep that in mind and draw your own conclusions with regard to it. I wish I had 2 hours and we could take care of all of that matter. I don't all of you be mad as everything if I did that. I'm not going to take that kind of time. But implicit in the whys are the solutions to the problems, and we will try to emphasize that a little bit as we go along. All right, why number one. Reason number one as to why all of these problems have come about. Because, friends and brethren, there was too much, and there is too much networking among congregations. That's why. That's one great big reason as to why all of this happened. In view of the way things are set up in the Scriptures with regard to congregations, it should never, ever be possible for a congregation to go haywire in an area, or a preacher to go haywire in an area, and then all of a sudden, whatever it is that he's chasing after, that kind of stuff to just spread from here to kingdom come. Yet that is exactly what happened in connection with all this business here. The churches are set up, all congregations ideally are to have elders. The elders are to tend the flock of God which is among them, and that argues independence. That establishes and says that each group is an independent group and is to operate upon its own. And I like to compare the congregations or the churches to panes in a great big window of some kind. Now let's say you have some rocks, and you have the right to throw one rock at a time, and you're going to try to do this window in. That being the case, the only way you're going to do it is be able to do the whole thing in. You're going to have to take it a pane at a time. And I see that as a part of the wisdom of God in the scheme of things. You want me to tell you how somebody can infiltrate the whole Roman system? All they have to do is get to the Vatican. That's all they have to do. And if they can get in there and have good influence there, they can influence the whole, every bit of it, the whole system, because of the very nature of the organizational structure. You want me to tell you how it is that anybody can infiltrate just about any denominational body on the face of this earth? All in the world they have to do is infiltrate the convention or the synod or what have you, and you'll pretty much get the job done. You want me to tell you what it's going to take to infiltrate the churches of Christ throughout the land and throughout the world? At least ideally speaking, I tell you what you're going to have to do. In terms of the scheme of God, you are going to have to take them one at a time. And I see that as a part of, a great big part of, the wisdom of God in connection with the independence of congregations. And I say to you again that there should never be a situation where the congregation in Greenwood goes crazy, haywire, some way or other into false doctrine, and all of a sudden that thing spreads across Arkansas, and then numbers and numbers of churches become implicated in that sort of thing. Anytime you see that, you can rest assured that there is something that's awry, and I mean seriously so. And so it is with the institutional problems that swept the land, yea, that swept the world so far as God's people were concerned. So why did this division come about? I'll tell you one of the reasons why. Because there was and there is too much networking, too much interaction, too much denial of, and lack of understanding of with regard to the business of independence. Park Hill here is an independent congregation. They set their own policies about what they're going to do and how they're going to act in keeping with their understanding of the truth of God. And what they do here doesn't have one thing on earth to do with another single congregation on the face of God's good earth. And again, I say, if you're going to infiltrate the entirety of the system, you are going to have to do it one at a time. The devil is going to have to take them one at a time, at least as you view it again from the ideal. Point number 2. We've had a big problem, and we've had it for a long, long time. Now, this does go back before the turn of the century, because it's one of the foundation problems with regard to the missionary society and the divisions and the problems that occurred in connection with that. And point number 2 is a failure to distinguish between the church general and the church local and understand how it is that they relate to each other, or to be more accurate about how it is that they don't relate to each other. Now, The formation of the Christian Missionary Society came about, by and large, founded upon a misunderstanding of that matter right there. And there were brethren who believed that the church general or local, or the church universal, is constituted of all of the local congregations in the world. That was their concept, the universal church. The basic unit of the church universal is the local church. And so you draw the big circle, and then you draw all the little circles within the big circle, and that's the way that's correctly represented. And I'm here to tell you that that is not the way that is correctly represented. Whatever in this world it is that is within the confines of the church general of the universal body of Christ has been baptized into it. And do I have to say to you that you do not baptize a church into anything? When the Ethiopian obeyed the gospel in Acts 8, what local church was he a member of? Somebody tell me that. Was he a member of the church general? He was a member of the spiritual body of Christ, the church universal. He was not a member of any local congregation anywhere. The basic unit of the church general is the individual Christian. And it's just, if you take the view that the church general is constituted of all the churches otherwise, then you get into all kinds of problems. Very, very serious problems. Like, for example, that being the case, you could have hypocrites in the universal church that is in right relationship with God. Because there are hypocrites in local churches. And if the sum of the universal church is local churches, then the hypocrites that are in local churches are in the universal church, and that means they're in proper relationship with the Father. And I flatly deny that is the case. It just absolutely is not the case. Now I'll tell you something else. If the church is constituted of local churches, the sum and circumference of it is constituted of local churches, then the modern Diotrephes like fellows that we have running around these days can throw somebody out of a right relationship with the Father. Diotrephes went about throwing people out of the church, out of the local fellowship there. Well, if the universal church, the sum total of it is local churches, if you threw somebody out of the local church, you'd throw him out of the universal church. That is to say, you would be throwing him out of a right relationship with the Father. And you can't do that. Nobody has that. I can't do that to you, and you can't do that to me. Nobody has that kind of power. The local fellowship is one relationship. The basic unit of the church universal is the Ethiopian. The individual Christian constitutes that. But because that wasn't understood, the missionary society became a reality. Now, there were some other things that went into that, but that's one of the main foundation pieces that brought about the missionary society was that kind of thinking. Get your history books out and read them just a little bit. We talk about how it is that if we are ignorant of the past, that it is bound to repeat itself. And I'm here to tell you tonight that there is not 2 cents worth of difference in terms of principle in the sponsoring church arrangement that we have today and then the missionary society that was fought, lo, these many years ago. But because we've not made that distinction, and because we have been confused about it, it's just a little bitty short jump, a little bitty hop there from this concept of the church constituted of all these churches. It's just a little bitty hop then to getting all of these churches working in concert, or to the idea of a federation or a collectivity of churches. And then all of a sudden the concept of the independence of the local church necessarily goes down the drain, as we've already talked about. You can't have the two together. Well, that's what's going on right now. Our brethren these days, they don't think anything about a congregation planning a program that's bigger than it can handle and then start begging money all over the country to help them get the job done. What is that? That's a federation of churches. It's a collectivity of churches, and by definition, it's a denomination is what it is. That's what a denomination is a collectivity of churches. But brethren don't think anything about that. You know why they don't? Because we still have brethren running around thinking that the church universal is constituted of all the local churches. And again, that's just 1 inch away from activating all of these churches in a collective way in some kind or other, or a bunch of them here, or a bunch of them there, or whatever. And every bit of it is as haywire as it is. Why did we have the problems, or why did the divisions occur? That's one of the big reasons that we have had these problems, and that's one of the big reasons that the problems continue with us until this day. Point number 3, a failure to uniformly apply rules of interpretation that had been preached for years. And I'm not going to stand up here and say just because something had been preached for years, therefore blah, blah, therefore it's good and sound and solid. I'm going to say, but I will add this, that preaching that had been done for years is solidly based in Scripture. Now that puts a different complexion on things. Anytime you hear, you listen to me, anytime you hear anybody get up, and it's going on these days, and don't you think one minute that it isn't. You hear some guy get up and hoot, and start laughing about these old Church of Christ interpretive methods having to do with precepts or commandments, and then examples or illustrations, and then implications. Let me tell you something, folks. You had better watch whatever it is that he says next. I'm telling you. Because he has taken a trip, and he's going to take you with him if he can. There's some fellows running around the country right now preaching that kind of thing. They're making fun of those ideas, hooting at them, scoffing at them, and the brethren are applauding them, and I don't mean that in a figure of speech. I mean literally so. They've taken a trip. And there's a reason for it, and not only is there a reason for it, there is a self-admitted reason for it on the part of at least some of them. And that is that the old interpretive method, now tomorrow night we're going to talk about the new hermeneutic in a little bit more detail, but the reasoning is that the old method of interpreting the Scriptures, all of that kind of thing, is too restricting. And there's some things we want to do, and we can't get those things in connection with these matters here, and so we're just going to go back foundationally, and we're going to change our whole approach to the text and our whole approach to interpreting the Bible. Now that's what the new hermeneutic is all about. If you've wondered why that thing has come about, and why it's enjoying the level of success that it is, that's it. It's because the people that truly understand things understand that there are a lot of things that are going on that have been going on now for decades that you cannot establish as authorized under the heading of precepts, examples, or implications. So we're going to have to ditch that. And one of the ways we're going to ditch that is we're going to make fun of it. And what you have there, you have a bunch of old ignorant pioneer preachers somewhere or other, and they started all this stuff. And now what they've done is they just passed it down from one generation to the next, and this generation, like a bunch of little old ignorant birds in a nest, we just gobbled all of that up. And all in the world it is just Church of Christ tradition stuff. That's all that is. And what we need to do is we need to set all of that aside, and we need a whole brand new approach. And again, we'll talk about that a little bit more tomorrow night. Now let me tell you something. In all of the stuff that goes on these days, that stuff that is distasteful to me, that is the biggest bunch of foolishness that I've ever heard. When you start talking about precepts or commandments, you start talking about illustrations, you start talking about implications, friends and brethren, that is not Bible talk. That's talk. That's how we communicate, for pity's sake. You do it all the time. I do it all the time. Sometimes you tell somebody just flat out what you want them to know. Sometimes you illustrate your point. Sometimes you imply your point. Those are the means and the methods of communication, for pity's sake. The Bible is a book of communications. Therefore, it uses the methods of getting the job done. And you can do a series of lessons on that. I'd venture to say, now maybe I'm wrong, maybe somebody can find a page, but I just almost venture to say that I can find you an implied truth on every page of your Bible. I mean, that's not something that's far-fetched, and it's not Church of Christ traditional. Have we worn Acts 15 out in that regard? I hope so. That's the way I feel about that. I hope that Acts 15, when you turn over there, falls out of your Bible. I hope it's so ragged you can't hardly read it. You want me to tell you why? I'll tell you why. Because in Acts 15, you have it all wrapped up in a nice, neat little package where the Apostle Peter and Paul and Barnabas and James, would you believe it, used a bunch of old Church of Christ interpretive methods in order to establish the truth of the occasion. Isn't that an interesting thing? The thing at issue is whether or not a Gentile had to be proselyted to Judaism or to be saved. Whether or not he had to be circumcised. And the Apostle Peter said, let me tell you about that. You know what he did? He reminded them of an example, some things that had happened to him. He said, brethren, you know that a good while ago God made choice among you that by my mouth the Gentiles should hear the word of the gospel and believe. And God, who knoweth the heart, bear them witness, giving them the Holy Spirit, even as he did unto us. And he made no distinction between us and them, cleansing their hearts by faith. You know what he's doing there? He's looking back to Acts 10 and Acts 11. That's what he's doing. He established the truth of the occasion upon the basis of an illustration, an illustrated truth in his life. And then lo and behold, James or Paul and Barnabas come along, and they established the truth on the basis of just one little verse there. That's verse 12. And you know how they did it? On the basis of implied truths or implication. The source, by the way, implies, the hearer infers. And verse 12 says, and all the multitude kept silence, and they hearkened unto Barnabas and Saul, or Paul, rehearsing what signs and wonders God had wrought among the Gentiles through them, period. That's it. That's all there is to it. Well, why in the world were they doing that in the heat of the controversy of the hour? I'll tell you why. Because as they had gone about preaching and teaching among the Gentiles, preaching the gospel, as they accepted it and obeyed the gospel, the Lord obviously was with them in their work, because of the signs and the wonders that were performed. And that being the case, he being with them in that work, the Gentiles were accepted on the basis of their proper relationship to the gospel of Christ, and they didn't have to be proselyted to anything. And would you believe it, they used that old Church of Christ interpretive method that started, by a bunch of old pioneer preachers in the United States of America. Isn't that an interesting thing? And then you know what James said? James said, let me put the cap on that, let me settle it by just precept or plain statement of fact. And then what he does is, when you get down to verse 14, 15, he just quotes Amos 9. And Amos talked about the nature of the church, and he says it's going to be constituted Jew and Gentile. The quote is verse 16, after these things I'll return, I'll build again the tabernacle of David, which is fallen, and that's a prophecy of the New Testament church. I will build again the ruins thereof. I will set it up, that the residue of men may seek after the Lord, and all the Gentiles upon whom my name is called, saith the Lord, who maketh these things known from of old. How did he establish the truth of the matter? He just simply said this is what Amos is talking about. The nature of the church is what Amos prophesied way back when, in Amos the 9th chapter. It's what Amos the prophet was talking about. So you have the truth stated there, and the issue settled upon the basis of precept. You have it settled upon the basis of implied truths, verse 12, and you have it settled upon the basis of illustrated truths, the Apostle Peter looking back to the events of Acts 10, Acts 11. And then one of my brothers, that I don't care how funny he is, and I don't care how cute he is, and I don't care how crowd-pleasing he is, gets up in front of an audience and has the audacity to talk about that means of doing things as just a bunch of old Church of Christ traditional stuff that needs to be discarded in favor of better matters. If it isn't blasphemy, it's right at the edge of it. And I'm inclined to think, just to be real honest with you, that it's just right square in the middle of it. Point number 4. I'm not going to talk much longer here. Misunderstanding of the true issues that have been involved. How that matter has been misunderstood. I know that. I talk to people. And constantly we were having to shift gears from how to who. And here's a brother who wants to talk about the how, and I want to talk about the who. And he wants to talk about methods, and I want to talk about organizations. And lo and behold, we just spend our time going from the one to the other. He'd talk about a method, and I'd say, we're not talking about methods. That's not what we're talking about. We're not talking about methods of doing anything. We are talking about who it is that is authorized to do a certain thing. We're not talking about methods. We're not talking about what. We're talking about who it is that is to do what it is we are charged to do. Speaking about the business of the missionary society, you suppose there's anybody who is of the mind that the missionary society is a how? or a method of getting something done. Everybody understood that the missionary, or at least many understood that the Missionary Society was an organization that used its own house, its own methods of getting things done. And if we don't understand that, you know what we ought to do? Every one of us, we ought to get up and go apologize to these Christian church people, what we ought to do, for causing all the ruckus we caused in connection with that. And I submit unto you that was understood pretty well. It ought to be understood now that the Missionary Society is not a house. It's not a method of doing anything. It is an organizational structure that enacts its own methods of doing things. And so it is with the denominational Sunday school or an edification society. That's not a how. It's not a method of doing something. It is an organization within an organization using its own methods to a given end. But for some reason or other, I don't know why. I don't know. The issue has never been understood by many. And would to goodness that simple point right there could get in the heads of all brethren everywhere. It'd go a long way to help us get some things resolved, need to be resolved. Point number 5. Now this is going to be you're probably going to wonder why I even threw this in the outline. Point number 5 is a failure to understand the purpose of the organization of the local church. Well, somebody says, well, everybody understands the purpose of the organization of the local church. Well, I'm not sure about that. Let me tell you something. Nobody ever goes out here and says, okay, folks, let's get organized. Let's get us president, vice president, something or other here, treasurer. Let's get organized. Somebody says, well, okay, what are we going to do? Well, we're not worried about what we're going to do. We just need to get organized. You know, nobody does that. Anytime, every time, under normal, sensible circumstances, you have an organization. The organization is with a view to function. Isn't that simple? How in the world hard is that? The reason anybody sets up an organization of any kind, in the business world, in the educational world, in any kind of world, the organization is not something that's isolated. Somebody said, boy, don't we have a nice organization here? Yeah, what do you do? Why, we don't do anything, but boy, isn't our organization something? I mean, nobody does that. We get organized in order that we might do something, for pity's sake. What is the organization of the church that is specified in the divine record for? It is there in order that we might do some things. What are those things? The things that God wants us to do together. You ever heard of specifics and generics? I should have mentioned that earlier in connection with some other things, but everybody here knows about that. And we talk about when a thing is specified, that takes care of everything else. Well, so it is with this matter here. The organization of the church is specified. Elders, deacons, and saints. That's it. The denominational organization is out. Universal Romanism is out. Universal organization is out. Elders, deacons, and saints. The organization of the local fellowship of Christians. Why? In order that we might do some things together. What things? The things that God has authorized for us to do. And then I come along and say, well, now let's see, in order to get done what it is that the Lord wants us to do, I think we ought to set up out here another organizational structure to assist us in blah, blah. Now, what do you think about that? That's one of the things that has divided us. And isn't that a hard thing? I submit unto you there isn't anything hard about that at all. And if we just take that one point there and get it in proper place in our minds, that would cover a multitude of sins. Well, point before last point. One of the things that has brought this division about is missing what I choose to refer to as the rule of consistency. If we can logically, scripturally, go out here, set up a human institution, organization, as an adjunct to the church to do the work that the Lord gave the church to do in one area of our functioning, then friends and brethren, doesn't consistency mean anything? If we can do that in connection with one part of our work, then why can't we do it in connection with another part of our work, and then another part of our work, and in connection with it all? And one of the reasons that we've had some of the problems that we've had is just simply because we've not been willing to fess up to the rule of consistency. If we can go out here and set up a benevolent society to do the benevolent work of the church, then we can go out here and set up a preaching society to do the preaching of the church, and we can go out here and set up an edification society to do the edification work of the church. Now, why? You tell me why that doesn't follow. The stock answer to that is, oh yeah, but what you don't understand is that the church is its own edification society, and the church is its own preaching society, but the church is not a home. Well, I understand the church is not a home, but what does that mean? Does that mean that the church cannot do its own benevolent work aside from a human order of some kind? Then pray tell, what did the church do in Acts 4 and in Acts 6? And in other places where benevolent work was done by congregations, separate and apart and aside from human anything being instigated or being involved in the program. The fact of the matter is that the church, through the God-given organization, can do everything that God has assigned us to do and expects us to do through the God-given arrangement. In the field of preaching, so it is. The principle pertains. In the field of edification, the principle pertains. Now, there ain't any difference between those three things. And it seems to me like that if we could, that the rule of consistency could dawn upon us, that maybe, just maybe, that business of proving too much might really help us. You ready for the missionary society? Are you? Are you ready to apologize to those folks? Are you ready for the edification society, headquartered in Little Rock or somewhere or other, that tells the Park Hill congregation what they teach in given class situation, what material to use and when to use it and all that? Are you ready for all that kind of thing like the denominational world has? I dare say that you're not. And then lo and behold, we isolate the benevolent society and say, well, it's okay. That's okay, not okay. The rule of consistency, if we would accept it and apply it, would help us greatly. One last point and I'm through. One of the reasons that we've had the divisions and the problems that we have had is what I call denying the obvious. Just simply denying the obvious. Now, and let me add this to that. When we get in a situation where we do that, we're in trouble. So, when I start doing that, somebody's backed me up in a corner somewhere. When I start denying the obvious, then I've been cornered or corralled. Why else would I do that? Let me give you a couple of illustrations. In 1 Timothy 5 and verse 16, Paul said, if any man understood, that believeth hath widows, let her relieve them. Let not the church be burdened, that it may relieve them that are widows indeed. And we still have people running around. We still have them, folks. They're still running around saying that there is no difference between individual action and church action. There is no difference between what the individual Christian is to do and what it is that we are to do together. What 1 Timothy 5:16 say? It addresses the individual Christian. Here's something you need to do. Let not the church be charged. It makes that distinction. Some people say the church is the individual. Well, of course, that's not so. Church is a collective noun, and the church is not the individual. It is constituted of individuals, but the church is not the individual. And the text addresses the individual Christian from time to time, and it says, you under Christ do this. From time to time, the text addresses us in our collective capacities in a local fellowship of Christians, and it says, you people together do thus and so. If we don't make that distinction, then many, many passages do not have their proper place with us. But to deny the distinction is to deny the obvious. And 1 Timothy 5 and verse 16 is the obvious. What it says is that before my mother died, she was a widow. My brother and I had obligations to her, and we were obligated as disciples of the Lord to see to her needs in order that the collectivity or the group of Christians of the local church not be charged with that responsibility. Well, somebody says, well, yeah, but what if the kids don't do it? Not talking about that. We always manage some way to get sidetracked on that discussion when trying to make this point. Not talking about that. The only thing I'm after right now is the fact that the verse obviously makes a distinction between my duty under Christ with regard to my mother and then responsibilities or the lack thereof in this instance of the church overall. Now, somebody says, well, I don't accept that distinction. Well, that's what I'm talking about. One of the reasons that we've had the problems we've had is just simply because we've denied the obvious. One more and I'm through. And that's over there. And have you ever heard of James 1:27? James 1:27. You take James 1:27 and try to make it apply to our work together. Try to make it apply to the work of the local church as we all work together in a collective way. And it won't work. The verse is individual in its address, it's individual in its application, and it's very easily determined because there are two responsibilities that are spelled out for us in James 1:27. One of them is to visit, and the other is to keep. And if you can determine who it is that's to do the keeping, then you know who it is that's to do the visiting. Now, it's just that simple. And if you want to deny the obvious, deny it. But that's one of the reasons that we're having some of the problems we have today, and the reason that some of the divisions exist. You're not going to satisfy the demands of James 1:27 by throwing $5 in a plate when it comes around on Sunday morning. That's individual in address. The way you satisfy the demands of that is you look up and around. Somebody needs something, you go over and provide whatever it is that they need. That's the application of that. You don't get the job done by participating in the collection there and thinking, well, I took care of James 1:27 today. That'll not do it. That absolutely will not do it. If you understand who it is that is to do the keeping of the verse, you understand who it is that's to do the visiting. Can you diagram a sentence? Well, most of you, I would imagine, can do that. Let me challenge you to go home tonight and piddle around with that. James 1:27, take a piece of paper and a pencil and diagram a sentence. It isn't hard to do. And you'll see that what I just said is so, and that's what the verse says. Pure religion and undefiled before our God and Father is this, to visit the fatherless and widows in their affliction and to keep oneself unspotted from the world. Have any idea who's to do the keeping, folks? Have any idea? To keep oneself unspotted from the world. Is that group action of some kind? Indeed it is not. Whoever it is that's to do the keeping does the visiting. And it's just that simple, and the obvious has been denied now decade after decade after decade, and I might add to our shame, it has been denied. And we come up with all these little old piddling dodges on this and dodges on that. Somebody comes along and says, well, what that means is the church can't practice pure and undefiled religion. Well, don't you think that just maybe pure and undefiled for the religion, for the church might be spelled out somewhere else? Don't you? Whatever passage it is, it obligates us together, and our work as a congregation constitutes pure and undefiled religion. You're just going to have to go somewhere else, other passages to find that information. But you don't look at this and say, well, if that's individual and application, the church can't practice pure and undefiled religion. That is so piddling that it is just pitiful in the extreme. And what it has done is it has assisted many, many, many people, that kind of thing, in denying the obvious truths of the text. This dangerous stuff. Well, I talked longer than I usually, boy, did I ever, longer than I usually do. But you hadn't done too much squirming, and that sure is nice of you. And I promise you, if you come back tomorrow night, some of you do, I'll try not to talk that long. But I spent too much time on that, on the 40s and 50s and 60s more than I meant to. But you listen well, and I deeply appreciate that. And hope you'll come for the other studies. If you're in any way subject to the Lord's invitation tonight, you can let us know now while we stand and sing the song that's been selected.